penniless ex-duke inherited his grandfather's warhorse. What he found in its saddle changed his fate forever. The letter was still warm from the horse's body heat when Julian Blackwood pulled it from the hidden compartment, his fingers trembling so violently he nearly dropped the paper that would either save him or destroy him completely. The wax seal, crimson, bearing the crest of a family he'd been told never existed, cracked beneath his thumb, as the warhorse, ancient and scarred, watched him with eyes that held too much knowledge for an animal. Outside the crumbling stable where Julian had been sleeping for 3 weeks since losing everything, rain hammered London's streets like judgment, and inside the letter, written in his dead grandfather's hand, were words that would unravel every truth Julian had ever been told. "My boy, if you're reading this, then I am gone, and you have nothing left. Good. Only those with nothing left are desperate enough to hear the truth. You are not a Blackwood. Wait, before the next confession unfolds. If this story has already stirred your heart, tell us where you're watching from. To make sure you don't miss the next betrayal, kiss, or redemption, subscribe and join our circle. The next heartbeat might change everything. Now, back to the scene." Julian's vision blurred as he read the words again, his breath coming in sharp gasps that fogged in the November cold. Not a Blackwood, the family name he'd worn for 26 years like armor, the dukedom he'd inherited at 21 and lost at 25 through spectacular ruin and his father's hidden debts, none of it had ever truly been his. The horse, a massive destrier named Tempest, who'd carried his grandfather through the Crimean campaign and somehow survived to the impossible age of 32, shifted in the shadows. The beast should have been dead a decade ago, but had persisted with the same stubborn refusal to surrender that had apparently run in his grandfather's blood. Julian had inherited nothing when his creditors seized the estate except this horse, which they deemed too old and worthless to bother selling. Now he understood why his grandfather had arranged it that way. His hands shook as he continued reading. "Your father was my son by law, not by blood. I married your grandmother knowing she carried another man's child, a prince's child to be precise. Prince Alexander of Wallenburg, a kingdom that existed for 300 years before it was swallowed by the Austrian Empire in 1847. Your grandmother was Princess Catherine, his wife, smuggled to England with her unborn son when the Revolution came. The Wallenburg royal line was hunted to extinction by those who overthrew them. Every prince, princess, duke, and cousin slaughtered or disappeared. Your father never knew his true heritage because knowing would have killed him. But you, my boy, you have the face of your true grandfather, the bearing of kings, and most importantly, you have nothing left to lose. Beneath Tempest's saddle, you'll find more than this letter. There is a map to something I've protected for 40 years, the Wallenburg crown jewels, hidden before the Revolution, worth enough to buy back your life 10 times over. But more than wealth, you'll find proof of your bloodline, documents that could restore you to a throne that technically still exists, if you're mad enough or brave enough. The horse knows the way. Trust him when you trust nothing else. And remember, blood makes you royal, but choices make you worthy." The letter was signed simply, "Henry Blackwood, who was never your grandfather, but loved you as if he were." Julian's laugh emerged as something broken, echoing in the stable that smelled of hay and horse and his own unwashed desperation. A prince. He was apparently a prince of a dead kingdom, grandson to royalty massacred in their beds, heir to a crown that existed only in history books and the fever dreams of old revolutionaries. It was insane, impossible, absolutely mad. And yet, he looked at Tempest, who was watching him with an expression that seemed almost expectant. The horse had been his one companion these past weeks, as Julian had descended from duke to debtor to vagrant, sleeping in abandoned stables and selling everything he owned except the clothes on his back. The beast had followed him through London streets with eerie certainty, as if knowing where they were going, even when Julian didn't. "You know where it is," Julian whispered to the horse. "Don't you, old man? You've been waiting all these years for someone to read that letter." Tempest nickered softly and pawed the ground. Julian pulled himself to his feet, his body aching from sleeping on hay and skipping too many meals. He moved to the horse's saddle, a military saddle worn smooth by decades of use, and began examining it with new eyes. There, beneath the leather that formed the seat, he found the hidden compartment his grandfather described. Inside, a rolled oilcloth package. His heart hammering, Julian unwrapped it. A map, hand-drawn and annotated in his grandfather's precise military hand. Not of England, but of somewhere else, a coastal region Julian didn't immediately recognize, marked with X's and notations in what looked like German or something similar. Coordinates, landmarks, and a name: Schwarzfels Castle, Wallenberg. Beneath the map, documents, old, fragile, but preserved with obvious care. Birth certificates in a language Julian barely recognized. A marriage certificate between Prince Alexander of Wallenberg and Princess Catherine Marie of Saxony. Letters bearing royal seals. And photographs, daguerreotypes, showing a young woman who looked hauntingly like Julian's own mother, standing beside a stern man in military uniform who had Julian's jaw, his cheekbones, his deep-set eyes. His true grandfather, Prince Alexander. The last document made Julian's breath stop entirely. A declaration of succession dated 1846, naming Prince Alexander's line as heirs to the Wallenberg throne in perpetuity, signed by the king himself and witnessed by officials whose elaborate seals suggested this wasn't some forgery or fantasy. "Christ," Julian breathed, "it's all real." A sound from outside the stable, footsteps, voices. Julian's pulse spiked with the fear that had become his constant companion. Creditors still hunted him, hoping to squeeze blood from stones. Men he'd once called friends now crossed streets to avoid him. The world had made abundantly clear that a duke without money was worth less than a beggar, because at least beggars didn't represent debts unpaid. He shoved the documents back into their oilcloth, grabbed Tempest's reins, and moved to the stable's back entrance. The horse followed without resistance, his massive hooves surprisingly quiet on the cobblestones. "Where, then?" Julian whispered, studying the map by moonlight as they emerged into an alley behind the stable. "Where is this Schwarzfels Castle? Where's Wallenberg?" Tempest turned west, toward the docks, and began walking with the steady determination of a creature who knew exactly where he was going. Julian had no money for passage abroad, no resources beyond a dying horse and a map to a kingdom that no longer existed. Every shred of logic screamed that this was madness, that he should burn these documents and try to rebuild some semblance of normal life. But he'd tried normal. He'd followed every rule society dictated, played the role assigned to him, been the perfect duke, until his father's sins caught up with him. And normal had left him sleeping in stables and selling his mother's jewelry for bread. Perhaps madness was worth attempting. "All right, old man," Julian said, mounting Tempest with the ease of someone who'd learned to ride before he could walk. "Show me the way to my grandfather's secrets. Show me the way to whatever the hell I'm supposed to be." The horse moved through London's streets like a ghost, navigating with uncanny precision toward the Thames, toward the docks, toward whatever impossible future waited across the water. Behind them, Julian left the wreckage of his life as the Duke of Blackwood. Ahead waited either treasure or oblivion, a throne or a grave, destiny or delusion. At this point, Julian couldn't quite tell the difference and found he no longer cared. The docks at midnight were a different London entirely. Dark, dangerous, populated by people for whom the law was merely a suggestion and morality an expensive luxury. Julian moved through them with Tempest at his side, the horse drawing curious glances but no challenges. Something about the beast's bearing, the scars visible even in dim lamplight, suggested he'd survived worse things than dock thieves. Julian had sold his last possession, a silver pocket watch that had been his mother's gift, to a pawnbroker 3 days ago. The coins were hidden in his boot, enough for perhaps a week's food if he was careful, or passage on the cheapest vessel if he was desperate. He was desperate. The problem was finding a captain willing to take a passenger with almost no money and a warhorse to a destination Julian couldn't even properly name. The map showed coastal features, a castle, coordinates, but no modern borders, no country names he recognized. Wallenberg had been absorbed into the Austrian Empire 70 years ago, its territories divided, its name erased from maps. "You're lost, boy." Julian turned to find a woman watching him from the shadows of a ship's loading platform. She was perhaps 50, weathered by wind and sun, dressed in men's clothing and wearing the expression of someone who'd seen enough of humanity to be thoroughly unimpressed by it. "Observant," Julian said, too tired to pretend otherwise. "And your quality gone to ruin." Her eyes, sharp, assessing, took in his expensive coat now filthy and torn, his aristocratic bearing poorly hidden beneath exhaustion. "What's a man like you doing at the docks at midnight with a horse worth more dead than you are alive?" "Looking for passage." Julian pulled out the map, made a decision to trust his instincts. To hear. The woman stepped closer, studied the map by lamplight, and went very still. When she looked up, her expression had shifted from dismissive to intensely interested. "That's the Wallenberg coast," she said quietly, "or what used to be. Now it's a forgotten corner of nowhere that the empire barely governs and the locals rule themselves. Schwarzfels Castle has been abandoned for decades." She paused. "What's a ruined English duke doing with a map to dead royalty secrets?" Julian's surprise must have shown on his face, because she smiled without humor. "I know quality when I see it, boy, and I know ruin too. I'm Captain Elena Dvorak, and I run a ship that trades in things the Empire would rather stayed forgotten, which means I know the waters around Old Wallenberg like I know my own scars." She gestured to the vessel behind her, a merchant ship that had seen better decades. "Question is, what are you willing to trade for passage?" "I have almost nothing." "Then offer me what you do have. Information. Why does an English nobleman want to reach a dead prince's castle?" Julian met her eyes, saw something there that reminded him of his grandfather, that particular cynicism that came from surviving too much history. He made another decision, the kind that could doom him or save him. "Because I'm the dead prince's grandson," he said quietly. "And there's something hidden in that castle I need to find." Captain Dvorak's laugh was sharp as breaking glass. "Of course you are. Every third man I meet claims royal blood when he's desperate enough. You got proof or just pretty stories?" Julian pulled out the oilcloth, showed her the documents. She examined them with an expert's eye, her expression growing more complex with each page. "Saints and devils," she breathed. "These are real. I've seen enough forged papers to know genuine articles. And these—" She looked up at Julian with new respect. "Prince Alexander's line. I knew people who knew him before the revolution. They said he got his wife and unborn child out, but nobody knew where they vanished to. England. My grandmother became Mrs. Henry Blackwood. Smart woman. Better to be alive and common than dead and royal. Captain Dvorak rolled the documents carefully, handed them back. So, you're Prince Julian of absolutely nowhere, hunting treasure in a dead kingdom. That about sum it up? More or less. And you think I'm going to help you because you trade in things the Empire wants forgotten, Julian said, which suggests you're not fond of them. Because you knew people who knew my grandfather, which suggests you have some connection to Wallenberg's history. And because he gestured to himself, to Tempest, to the absurdity of his situation, because I have nothing left to lose, which makes me either very dangerous or very useful, depending on how you look at it. Captain Dvorak studied him for a long moment. Then she smiled, and this time it reached her eyes. I like you, boy. You're honest about your desperation, which is rarer than you'd think. And you're right, I've got no love for the Empire. My family were Wallenberg loyalists, lost everything when the revolution came. Been making them pay for it ever since, through tariffs they never collect and goods they never find. She extended her hand. I'll give you passage for free, and I'll guide you to Schwarzfels. In exchange, if you find what you're looking for, I get 10% of its value. Done. Julian shook her hand, felt calluses that spoke of decades hauling rope and steering through storms. We sail with the morning tide. Get yourself and that magnificent beast aboard before then. Fair warning, it's a rough crossing this time of year, and we're not exactly traveling in comfort. Captain Dvorak, Julian said as she turned to leave, why are you really helping me? She paused, looked back over her shoulder. Because when I was 12 years old, I watched revolutionaries burn my family's estate while my mother hid me in a root cellar. Before she died, the last thing she said was, "Someone will remember, Elena. Someone will make them pay. You might be a long shot and a fool's hope, but you're the first person in 40 years who might actually be able to deliver on that promise." Her eyes glinted hard. So don't disappoint me, Prince Julian. I'd hate to have wasted my last bit of optimism on another failed royal. The crossing took 6 days of the most miserable sailing Julian had ever experienced. The ship, named Retribution, with what Julian considered either perfect irony or terrible prophecy, was built for cargo, not comfort. He spent most of the journey below deck with Tempest, who bore the voyage with the stoic endurance of a creature who'd survived actual war. Captain Dvorak ran her ship with military precision, her crew a mix of loyalties and languages that reflected the fractured empire they navigated. Julian learned that she'd built her operation over 30 years, creating a network that smuggled everything from banned books to political refugees to goods the empire taxed into oblivion. "You're a revolutionary," Julian said on the 4th night when she invited him to share her cabin's meager warmth and cheaper wine. "I'm a businesswoman who happens to hate tyrants," she corrected. "There's a difference. Revolutionaries die for principles. I survive by being practical." She poured them both another glass. "Though I admit there's something appealing about the idea of a Wallenberg prince returning to claim his heritage. Makes good theater, if nothing else." "I'm not claiming anything," Julian protested. "I'm looking for jewels that might let me buy back some semblance of a life." "You're a terrible liar, boy," Elena's smile was knowing. "I've watched you study those documents every night. I've seen how you stand when you think nobody's looking, like a man trying on a crown he's not sure fits. You want that throne, even if you're too afraid to admit it." "The throne doesn't exist anymore." "Doesn't it?" Elena leaned back, her expression thoughtful. The empire absorbed Wallenberg, but they never formally abolished the monarchy. Technically, the crown still exists in legal limbo. And the territory itself, it's been neglected for decades. The empire doesn't care about it. The locals barely acknowledge Austrian authority. And there's enough resentment against the empire that a legitimate heir showing up might find more support than you'd think. Julian's heart began to race despite himself. "You're suggesting I could actually—" "I'm suggesting that treasure might be the least valuable thing you find in Schwarzfels," Elena interrupted. "But here's the thing about thrones, Julian. They don't care if you want them. They only care if you're willing to die for them. Are you?" He thought about his life in England, the dukedom that had been empty prestige, the society that had abandoned him the moment his money vanished, the hollow performance of nobility without purpose or power. He thought about sleeping in stables and selling his mother's jewelry, and the crushing weight of knowing he'd failed at every role he'd been given. "I don't know," he said honestly. "I don't know what I'm willing to die for yet." "Fair enough." Elena raised her glass. "Then let's see what you find in Schwarzfels." That'll tell you who you really are, better than any bloodline or document ever could. They drank to uncertain futures and impossible dreams, while the ship cut through dark waters toward a kingdom that existed only in memory and hope. Schwarzfels Castle rose from the coastal cliffs like a broken tooth, jagged and dark against storm-gray skies. Julian stood at the ship's rail, staring at the ruins that supposedly held his grandfather's secrets, and felt despair settle in his chest like frost. The castle was destroyed, not abandoned, but actively ruined. Whole sections had collapsed into the sea. The towers that remained were hollow shells, their roofs gone, their windows like empty eye sockets. Whatever siege or catastrophe had befallen it had been thorough enough to leave almost nothing intact. "The revolution," Elena said quietly beside him. "This was Prince Alexander's primary residence. The revolutionaries made an example of it, burned what would burn, demolished what wouldn't, salted the earth around it so nothing would grow. They wanted to erase every trace of the monarchy." "Then there's nothing left," Julian said, his voice flat with defeat. "No jewels, no treasure, nothing, just ruins." "Maybe," Elena studied the castle through a brass telescope. "But your grandfather fought at Crimea, right? Military mind, tactical thinker. If he hid something, he'd hide it where angry mobs wouldn't think to look." She lowered the telescope. "We don't know what survived until we search." They anchored in a sheltered cove and rowed to shore in a small boat, leaving most of Elena's crew with the ship. Only 3 came with them, hardened men who asked no questions and carried weapons with casual familiarity. Tempest swam the distance, his massive body cutting through the cold water with surprising grace, and emerged on the rocky beach shaking himself dry. The castle was worse up close. Julian picked through rubble and debris, each step revealing new destruction. Scorched stone, shattered glass, bones that might have been animal or might have been human, left to rot where they fell. The wind howled through broken walls, carrying the salt smell of the sea and the particular desolation of places where terrible things happened. "Where would he hide it?" Elena asked, studying Julian's map. "The coordinates point to the castle, but that's it, no specific location." Julian closed his eyes, trying to think like his grandfather, like a soldier, a strategist, someone who'd survived the Crimean War and kept royal secrets for 40 years. Where would a man like that hide something precious? "The horse," Julian said suddenly. "Tempest knows. My grandfather wrote that the horse knows the way." It sounded insane even saying it, but they'd come too far to ignore any possibility. Julian mounted Tempest, gave the beast his head, and watched in amazement as the warhorse began picking his way through the ruins with clear purpose. The horse led them through the destroyed Great Hall, past a collapsed chapel, around fallen towers, and finally to what must have been the castle's stables. Mostly intact because they'd been built partially underground, carved into the cliff itself. Tempest stopped before a specific stall, the one farthest from the entrance, and pawed the ground with clear intent. "Here," Julian breathed. "He's saying it's here." They dug with their hands, with tools borrowed from the ship, with desperation giving strength to exhausted bodies. 2 feet down, Julian's fingers struck something that wasn't stone. Wood, rotted but still solid, forming a box perhaps 4 feet square. His hands shook as they cleared away the last of the earth. The box was iron-bound, locked, bearing the Wallenberg crest. Julian used one of the crew's knives to break the lock, his heart hammering so hard he thought it might crack his ribs. Inside velvet bags that had mostly rotted to threads, but their contents gleamed eternal. Jewels, diamonds the size of quail eggs, rubies that caught the dim light and turned it to fire, emeralds and sapphires and pearls, worked into crowns and necklaces and rings that spoke of centuries of accumulated royal wealth. More treasure than Julian could have imagined, enough to buy not just his life back, but entire estates, entire futures. But beneath the jewels, wrapped in oilcloth that had somehow survived where velvet had not, a crown. Julian lifted it with trembling hands. It was gold worked with impossible delicacy, set with stones that represented every color of creation, sized for a man's head. His grandfather's head, he realized. This was Prince Alexander's crown, hidden here when the revolution came, waiting for an heir who might never appear. "Sweet Christ," Elena whispered. "That's the Wallenberg crown. I've seen paintings of it. That's worth more than everything in my ship combined." Julian stared at the crown in his hands, felt its weight, physical and metaphorical both. This wasn't just treasure. This was legitimacy, legacy, proof of his bloodline that no one could dispute. This was a throne made tangible. "Put it on," one of Elena's crew urged. "Let's see if it fits the prince." Julian's hands shook. He thought about his grandfather's letter. Blood makes you royal, but choices make you worthy. He thought about his life in England, the hollow performance of nobility. He thought about Elena's question, "Are you willing to die for it?" He lifted the crown toward his head and heard voices, many voices, approaching through the ruins. Elena's crew drew weapons instantly. Julian shoved the crown back into the box, his pulse racing. Through the broken stable walls, he could see perhaps 20 men approaching, armed with rifles and the particular confidence of people on their own territory. "Locals," Elena muttered. "Probably wondering what ship just anchored in their waters." A man stepped forward from the group, older, weathered, with the bearing of someone accustomed to command. He called out in German-accented English, "You are trespassing on forbidden ground. Explain yourselves before we assume you're thieves come to pick over royal bones." Julian stood, left the treasure box behind, and walked out to face them. Some instinct made him straighten his spine, lift his chin, adopt the bearing his tutors had spent years drilling into him. He might be dressed in rags, but he could still stand like a duke, or like a prince. "My name is Julian Blackwood," he called back, "though that's not my true name. My grandfather was Prince Alexander of Wallenberg. I've come to claim what's mine." Silence, then laughter, harsh, disbelieving. "Prince Alexander's line died with the revolution," the leader said. "Everyone knows wrong. Julian pulled out the oilcloth packet, showed them the documents at a distance. Prince Alexander got his wife and unborn son to England. That son was raised as my father. I am the grandson and rightful heir. Silence, then laughter, harsh, disbelieving. Prince Alexander's line died with the revolution, the leader said. Everyone knows wrong. Julian pulled out the oilcloth packet, showed them the documents at a distance. Prince Alexander got his wife and unborn son to England. That son was raised as my father. I am the grandson and rightful heir. More laughter, but uncertain now. The leader stepped closer, studying Julian's face with sudden intensity. You have his look, he admitted grudgingly. The jaw, the eyes. I knew the old prince when I was a boy. My father served in his guard. You could be his blood, or you could be a clever fraud with the right documents. Then how do I prove it? Julian demanded. You can't, the man said simply. There's no proof that would satisfy everyone. But there's tradition. He gestured to his men, who parted to reveal they'd surrounded not just Julian, but the entire stable entrance. If you truly are Prince Alexander's heir, you'll know the Wallenberg oath. Every royal child learned it at their mother's knee. Speak it now, in the old tongue, and we'll at least consider you might be telling the truth. Julian's heart sank. He didn't know any oath. He'd been raised English, speaking only English, knowing nothing of his true heritage until 6 days ago. But Tempest, old, scarred, impossibly persistent Tempest, moved beside him and nickered softly. And somehow, impossible as it seemed, Julian heard words in that sound, felt them, remembered them, knew them with the certainty of inherited memory or divine inspiration or pure desperate madness. He opened his mouth and spoke in a language he'd never learned. Ich schwöre bei Blut und Ehre, zu dienen und zu schützen, zu führen und zu opfern, bis mein letzter Atemzug, für Wallenberg, für das Volk, für die Krone, die schwerer wiegt als Gold. I swear by blood and honor to serve and protect, to lead and sacrifice, until my last breath, for Wallenberg, for the people, for the crown that weighs heavier than gold. The men stared at him in stunned silence. The leader's face had gone pale. How? He began. That oath hasn't been spoken aloud in 70 years. How do you know it? I don't know, Julian said honestly. But I spoke it, didn't I? The leader studied him for a long moment. Then, slowly, deliberately, he dropped to one knee. His men followed, a wave of bodies kneeling in the ruins of a dead kingdom, acknowledging a prince they'd never expected to meet. Your Highness, the leader said, his voice rough with emotion Julian didn't understand. Welcome home. The village was called Graustein, Gray Stone, and it clung to the cliffs below Schwarzfels Castle like a barnacle refusing to be dislodged by time or empire. Perhaps 300 people lived there, descendants of those who'd served the royal family for generations, who'd stayed loyal even after revolution came and monarchy fell and the world they knew collapsed. They welcomed Julian into their largest building, a combination tavern and meeting hall that smelled of wood smoke and old beer. The leader, who'd knelt in the ruins, introduced himself as Karl Brenner, former captain of what would have been the Royal Guard, now serving as the village elder. We've kept the old ways alive, Karl explained, pouring Julian something that might have been brandy or might have been paint thinner. Speaking the old tongue at home, teaching our children the histories the empire tried to erase, maintaining the castle grounds enough to keep it from falling entirely into the sea. We've been waiting, Your Highness. 70 years we've been waiting for a legitimate heir to return. Waiting for what? Julian asked. The monarchy is dead. The empire. The empire is dying, Karl interrupted. Oh, it looks strong in Vienna, in the capitals. But out here in the forgotten corners, their authority is a joke. They tax us when they remember we exist, which is rarely. They send officials who stay one winter and flee back to civilization. We govern ourselves, trade with whom we please, and acknowledge Austrian rule in name only because it's easier than fighting them. Elena, sitting beside Julian, leaned forward with interest. You're saying you're essentially independent? Functionally, yes. Legally, no. Which is where a legitimate heir becomes interesting. Karl's eyes gleamed. If Prince Alexander's grandson were to formally claim the throne, were to present the crown and the documents and the bloodline, were to demand the empire acknowledge his sovereignty over Wallenberg territory, well, it would create a legal complication they couldn't simply ignore. They'd send soldiers, Julian protested. They'd crush any attempt at restoration. Would they? Karl smiled. The empire is busy holding together a dozen different territories, managing conflicts with Prussia, dealing with nationalist movements in Hungary and Bohemia and everywhere else. Would they really waste resources fighting over a worthless coastal strip that nobody cares about, just to prove a point? Or would they quietly acknowledge your sovereignty in exchange for you not causing them larger problems? Julian's mind raced. You're talking about actually restoring the kingdom? I'm talking about giving Wallenberg back to the Wallenbergers, Karl said. We don't need empire. We need self-determination, fair laws, leaders who care whether we live or die. You're Prince Alexander's heir. That makes you our rightful ruler, if you're willing to rule. I don't know how to rule a kingdom, Julian said. I barely managed being a duke, and that ended in spectacular failure. You were a duke in England, playing by rules designed to keep you decorative and powerless, Elena interjected. Here, you'd be a king with actual authority over people who actively want you to succeed. Slightly different situation. Julian looked around the hall, at faces weathered by hard lives and harder histories, at people who'd maintained loyalty to a crown that had failed them 70 years ago. They were watching him with something that looked almost like hope, and it terrified him more than any amount of debt or ruin ever had. I need time, he said. Time to think, to understand what this would actually mean. Of course, Your Highness, Karl nodded. But not too much time. Winter comes early here, and ships can't navigate these waters once the storms begin. If you're going to make a decision, make it before the season turns. That night, Julian stood in a small room above the tavern, staring out at Schwarzfels Castle's ruins silhouetted against moonlight. Elena found him there, brought him something that might have been food, and sat beside him in companionable silence. What are you thinking? She finally asked. That I'm absolutely terrified, Julian admitted. That every instinct I have says this is madness. That I should take the jewels, return to England, rebuild my life quietly and sensibly. But I've lived that life already, safe, proper, following all the rules. And it was hollow, Elena, empty. I was a decoration in other people's stories, never the author of my own. He touched the window glass, cold against his fingers. These people, Karl, this village, they have nothing, and they've kept faith for 70 years that someone would return and make things right. How do I walk away from that? You walk away by being practical, Elena said. By acknowledging that you don't owe your life to ancestors you never met and people you just encountered. By choosing your own happiness over inherited obligation. Is that what you did? When you chose to become a smuggler instead of just accepting the empire's authority? Elena laughed. Touché. Fine, I'm a hypocrite. But Julian, and I'm saying this as someone who'd profit enormously from you staying, think carefully about what you're choosing. Crowns are heavy, thrones are lonely, and dead kingdoms don't tend to stay dead without good reason. What would you do if you were me? She considered, her scarred face thoughtful in the moonlight. I'd ask myself one question. What story do I want told about me when I'm gone? That I was a sensible man who chose comfort? Or that I was a mad fool who tried to resurrect a kingdom and maybe, just maybe, gave people something worth believing in? She left him alone with that question, and the night and the weight of decisions that would reshape everything. Julian spent 3 days walking through Graustein, talking to everyone who would speak with him, learning the truth of what Wallenberg had become. What he found broke his heart and steeled his resolve in equal measure. The village was dying, slowly, inexorably dying. The young people left for cities where opportunity existed, leaving behind the old and the stubborn and those too poor to escape. The empire taxed them on the few goods they could trade, but provided no services in return. No schools, no doctors, no infrastructure. They survived through stubbornness and mutual support, but survival wasn't the same as thriving. "We're a people without a future," an old woman told him as he helped her carry water from the village well. "Our children forget the old tongue, forget the old ways. In another generation, Wallenberg will be just a footnote in history books, if we're lucky enough to even get that." Julian met children who should have been in school, but instead worked adult jobs because survival demanded it. He met craftsmen whose skills would die with them for lack of apprentices. He met mothers who wept quietly when they thought no one was watching, knowing their daughters would have to marry outside the village or face lives of grinding poverty. And he met the former nobles, the remnants of Wallenberg aristocracy who'd lost everything but their names. They lived in homes barely better than shacks, worked common trades, wore their titles like embarrassing scars. But they remembered. They taught their children the old customs, maintained family trees stretching back centuries, waited with desperate patience for restoration that logic said would never come. "Your Highness," one of them said, a countess who now cleaned fish for merchants, "we don't need wealth or palaces. We just need acknowledgement, recognition that we exist, that we matter, that we're more than forgotten subjects of an empire that despises us." On the 4th day, Julian made his decision. He called a meeting in the village hall, invited everyone in Graustein, and stood before them with the Wallenberg crown in his hands. Cleaned of dirt, polished to gleaming magnificence, heavy with history and hope both. "I came here looking for treasure," he began, his voice steady despite his terror. "I thought I'd find jewels, buy back my life in England, return to comfort and safety. Instead, I found something more valuable and far more terrifying: purpose." He looked around the room, met eyes that held every shade of hope and doubt and desperation. "I can't promise to be a good king. I don't know how. I can't promise to restore Wallenberg to its former glory. That might be impossible. But I can promise to try, to stand between you and an empire that's forgotten you exist, to fight for your right to determine your own future, to honor the loyalty you've maintained for 70 years against all reason or reward." He lifted the crown, felt its weight, thought about his grandfather's words. "Blood makes you royal, but choices make you worthy." "If you'll have me," Julian said, "I claim the throne of Wallenberg, not to rule over you, but to serve you. Not to resurrect dead glory, but to build new possibilities. I'm Prince Julian of Wallenberg, and I swear by blood and honor to be worthy of your faith or die trying." He placed the crown on his head. For a heartbeat, silence. Then Karl Brenner stepped forward and knelt. The old countess followed. Then everyone, a wave of bodies dropping to their knees in acknowledgement not of the crown, but of the choice, the commitment, the mad, brave decision to care. "Long live King Julian!" Karl's voice rang out. "Long live the king!" The response shook the rafters, filled the hall, spilled out into the village streets where more voices took up the cry, spreading like wildfire through a people who'd forgotten what hope sounded like. Julian stood in a ruined kingdom's remnants, wearing a crown worth a fortune, surrounded by subjects who had nothing but faith, and felt more terrified and more alive than he'd ever felt in his perfectly proper life as an English duke. Elena stepped beside him, spoke quietly so only he could hear. "Well, Your Majesty, you've done it now. No going back." "No going back," Julian agreed, and smiled despite his terror. "Forward into whatever comes next." "Forward into whatever comes next," Elena echoed, and raised her glass. "To King Julian of Wallenberg, the maddest, bravest fool I've ever met." "I'll drink to that," Julian said, and did. The coronation took place in Schwarzfels Castle's ruins 3 days later, timed to coincide with the anniversary of Prince Alexander's wedding, a date Karl insisted was symbolically important. Julian stood in what remained of the Great Hall, surrounded by everyone from Graustein and delegations from nearby villages who'd heard rumors and came to witness history or madness, depending on their perspective. There was no priest. The empire had long ago reclaimed the only church for Austrian Orthodox use. Instead, Karl Brenner conducted the ceremony using rituals preserved in memory and handed down through generations. Julian knelt on stones that had witnessed 70 years of abandonment, wore a crown that had survived revolution and ruin, spoke oaths in a language he'd learned in 3 days of desperate study. The ceremony was interrupted twice, once by a delegation of Austrian officials who arrived to investigate reports of seditious activity, and once by a rainstorm that turned the ruins into a waterfall. The officials were managed by Karl, who presented them with carefully worded documentation suggesting Julian was merely a British aristocrat claiming ancestral property rights, nothing that contradicted Austrian sovereignty. The officials, clearly wanting to avoid complications with Britain, accepted this fiction and departed with warnings about proper procedures and legal channels. The rainstorm, Julian decided, was either God's judgment or God's blessing, depending on interpretation. He finished the coronation soaking wet, shivering, and laughing at the absurdity of claiming a throne while looking like a drowned rat. "Very dignified, Your Majesty," Elena observed, wringing water from her coat. "I'm starting to think dignity is overrated," Julian replied, and meant it. The feast afterward was humble, what the village could spare from winter stores, supplemented by supplies from Elena's ship. But it was genuine, joyful, the kind of celebration that came from people who'd forgotten they had anything to celebrate. Julian sat at a rough wooden table, wearing a crown and eating stew that was more turnips than meat, and listened to old soldiers tell stories about his grandfather, about Prince Alexander's courage at battles Julian had never heard of, his kindness to servants, his ability to make people believe in better futures, even when logic suggested otherwise. "You have his spirit," one old veteran said, gripping Julian's hand with surprising strength. "I can see it. That same stubborn refusal to accept what is, when what could be beckons." "I hope I have his wisdom too," Julian said. "I'm going to need it." The true work began the next morning, when Julian convened his first council, a gathering of former nobles, village elders, Elena, and anyone else who wanted to contribute. They met in the hall that had hosted the coronation feast, and Julian stood before them with no illusions about the magnitude of the task ahead. "We need 3 things immediately," he said, having spent half the night planning with Carl and Elena. Legitimacy, economy, and sustainability. In that order. Legitimacy you have, Carl said. The crown, the bloodline, the documents. Legitimacy we claim, Julian interrupted. But claiming isn't the same as recognition. We need the empire to acknowledge my sovereignty, or this is just theater. Elena, you mentioned legal complications. Explain. Elena stood, all business now. The empire absorbed Wallenberg under emergency provisions during the revolution. But they never formally abolished the monarchy through proper legal channels. They assumed the line was extinct, so why bother? If you petition for recognition, citing the original treaties that established Wallenberg's autonomy, you create a legal puzzle they'll have to address. And if they refuse, then you become a persistent administrative headache. You file appeals, you generate paperwork, you force them to spend resources managing you. Meanwhile, you govern as if you have authority, collect your own taxes, establish your own laws. You make de facto independence so complete that de jure recognition becomes a formality. Julian nodded slowly. Essentially, we act like a legitimate kingdom until they get tired of pretending we're not. Exactly. Which brings us to economy. One of the former nobles, a count who now fished for his living, interjected. Your Majesty, we're impoverished. The treasure you found helps, but we need sustainable income. What's our plan? Julian looked at the map they'd spread across the table, studying Wallenberg's coastline with new eyes. We have deep water harbors, we're positioned between major trade routes, and we're currently taxed by the empire but receiving no benefits. What if we became a free port? No tariffs, no trade restrictions, we offer neutral ground for merchants who want to avoid imperial taxes. That's smuggling, someone protested. That's free trade, Elena corrected with a smile, and perfectly legal if you're a sovereign entity setting your own trade laws. The empire would be furious, Carl warned. The empire is already managing nationalist movements in half a dozen territories, Julian countered. Would they really start a war over tariffs? Especially if we position ourselves as stabilizing rather than destabilizing. We're not rebelling, we're just asserting historical autonomy. Debate raged for hours. Some supported the plan, others feared imperial retaliation. But slowly, consensus emerged. They had nothing to lose and everything to gain. Remaining as they were meant slow death. This path offered at least a chance at survival. Sustainability, Julian said when they'd settled the economic framework. We need population. Our young people leave because there's no future here. We need to give them reasons to stay, and we need to attract new settlers. Who would come? The Countess asked. We have nothing to offer. We have freedom, Julian said. Freedom from imperial bureaucracy, from religious persecution, from the thousand small cruelties that drive people from their homes. We offer sanctuary to those the empire marginalizes. Jews, religious minorities, political dissidents. We become a refuge. That's dangerous, Carl said quietly. The empire won't tolerate us harboring their enemies. Then they'll have to acknowledge us to negotiate terms, Julian replied. Either way, we force recognition. It was audacious, possibly suicidal, absolutely in keeping with the madness of everything else Julian had done since finding that letter in Tempest's saddle. One more thing, he added. I'm selling the jewels. Silence. Everyone stared at him. Your Majesty, that's your personal fortune, someone protested. That's Wallenberg's future, Julian corrected. We use the money to rebuild infrastructure, establish schools, create incentives for settlement. A king's wealth means nothing if his kingdom dies. This is the choice. I can be rich and rule over ruins, or I can invest everything in giving this place a fighting chance. Elena laughed, that sharp, delighted sound. You're insane, Your Majesty, completely insane. Probably, Julian agreed, but I'm also right. We do this properly or we don't do it at all. The vote was unanimous. Winter came early that year, trapping Elena's ship in harbor for 3 months. She didn't seem to mind, throwing herself into Julian's restoration project with the energy of someone who'd been waiting years for exactly this kind of chaos. Together, they drew up treaties, drafted constitutions, planned trade routes, and sent carefully worded letters to Vienna explaining that Wallenberg's legitimate heir had returned and would be delighted to discuss terms of mutual recognition at the empire's convenience. The empire's response was predictable, a letter from some minor bureaucrat suggesting Julian was engaging in fantasy and should cease immediately or face consequences. Julian responded by declaring Wallenberg a free port, posting notices in 4 languages welcoming traders and merchants, and beginning construction on a proper dock facility. 3 trading ships arrived within the month, captains Elena knew who were willing to risk imperial displeasure for the chance to move goods without tariffs. Julian offered them fair terms, reliable harbor, and the novelty of dealing with a king who personally helped load cargo because the kingdom couldn't yet afford professional stevedores. Word spread. More ships came. The village began to transform. By spring, Graustein's population had grown by 50. Merchants, craftsmen, refugees from religious persecution, adventurers drawn by rumors of a mad king building a kingdom from nothing. They brought skills, resources, energy that had been missing for generations. Julian used the treasure carefully, investing in a school taught by a Jewish scholar fleeing Prague, a medical clinic run by a Hungarian doctor who'd been blacklisted for treating revolutionaries, infrastructure that slowly transformed ruins into the foundations of something viable. The empire sent inspectors. Julian welcomed them with transparent accounting, legal citations from treaties 300 years old, and absolutely no acknowledgement that anything he was doing was illegal. The inspectors departed confused, unable to find clear violations, but certain something was fundamentally wrong. "They don't know how to handle you," Elena observed, watching the inspector's ship disappear toward the horizon. "You're too small to be worth a military response, too legitimate to dismiss easily, and too profitable to nearby imperial territories to alienate completely. They're stuck." "Good," Julian said. "Stuck means negotiation eventually. Negotiation means recognition." It took 2 years. 2 years of building, arguing, surviving winter storms and summer droughts, managing a council of strong-willed former nobles and stubborn villagers, learning to govern with Elena's pragmatism and Karl's wisdom supplementing his own stumbling attempts at kingship. 2 years of trading Julian's English aristocratic polish for calluses from actual work, his entitled assumptions for hard-won understanding of how ordinary people actually lived, his fear of failure for the resilience that came from failing repeatedly and continuing anyway. 2 years of writing letters to Vienna that went unanswered, posting declarations that were ignored, existing in legal limbo while creating de facto sovereignty one decision at a time. And then, on a spring morning in his 3rd year as king, a ship arrived bearing imperial flags and a delegation of officials who looked considerably more senior than the minor bureaucrats who'd come before. Julian met them in Schwarzfels Castle, partially rebuilt now, its great hall restored to something approaching its former grandeur through communal effort and creative use of limited resources. He wore the Wallenberg crown, stood on a dais before a throne salvaged from the ruins, flanked by Karl in restored guard uniform and Elena in her captain's finest. Behind them, the former nobles wore their ancient titles with new dignity, and villagers who'd worked themselves to exhaustion rebuilding this place stood witness. The lead imperial official, a duke from Vienna with more titles than Julian could track, surveyed the scene with barely concealed surprise. Whatever he'd expected, it wasn't this, a functioning court, a restored castle, a king who carried himself with genuine authority rather than pretension. "Your Majesty," the Duke said, the title clearly sticking in his throat, "I bring a proposal from His Imperial Majesty regarding the situation in Wallenberg." "I'm listening," Julian said calmly, though his heart raced. "The Empire acknowledges your bloodline and your historical claim to Wallenberg sovereignty. However, we cannot simply cede territory without complications. Therefore, we propose the following. Wallenberg becomes an autonomous principality within the empire. You maintain internal sovereignty, your own laws, your own governance, your free port status. In exchange, you acknowledge the empire's ultimate authority in matters of foreign policy and imperial defense, and you pay a nominal annual tribute." Silence. Julian felt every eye in the hall on him. It was a compromise. Not full independence, but something close. Authority over their own lives, recognition of their existence, protection from imperial interference in daily governance. The tribute would be symbolic, the empire saving face while essentially granting what Julian wanted. It was everything he'd hoped for, and nothing like what his grandfather's generation would have accepted. It was pragmatic, modern, possible. "I'll need to consult my council," Julian said. "Of course, we'll return tomorrow for your answer." The council debated for hours. Some wanted full independence or nothing. Others argued this was the best possible outcome given their circumstances. Julian listened to every voice, weighed every argument, and finally made his decision. The next morning, he faced the imperial delegation again. "We accept," he said, with one modification. "The tribute will be paid not in gold, but in service. Wallenberg will maintain a rescue fleet for ships in distress along our coast, serving both imperial and independent vessels. This establishes our value to the empire while maintaining our dignity." The Duke considered, clearly calculating whether this was worth reporting back to Vienna or if he could authorize it himself. "Acceptable. We'll draft the treaty." And just like that, Wallenberg was reborn. The signing took place a month later, in Vienna, with all the ceremony the empire could muster. Julian traveled with a small delegation. Elena, Karl, and the countess who'd cleaned fish and now served as his foreign secretary because she was terrifyingly clever and spoke 6 languages. The imperial court watched with poorly concealed disdain as this upstart kingdom was formally recognized. Julian didn't care. He signed the treaty, accepted the emperor's perfunctory congratulations, and returned home to the real work. Because recognition was just the beginning. Over the next 5 years, Wallenberg transformed from forgotten ruin to thriving principality. The free port brought prosperity that spread through the territory like spring warmth. The school expanded into a university, drawing students from across the empire who wanted education without censorship. The refugee policy attracted talented, desperate people who built lives and contributed to growth that outpaced anyone's projections. Julian governed with a light hand and fierce protection of basic rights, establishing a constitutional monarchy that gave his subjects voice in their own governance. He married eventually, a Jewish merchant's daughter named Rebecca, who'd fled Vienna and stolen his heart through sheer brilliance and complete unwillingness to be impressed by crowns. They had children who grew up speaking 3 languages, who played in Schwarzfels Castle's rebuilt gardens, who learned early that privilege meant responsibility and crowns were tools for service rather than symbols of superiority. Elena stayed on as prime minister, using her smuggling expertise to build legitimate trade networks that made Wallenberg prosperous beyond its size. Karl trained a new generation of guards who protected borders without becoming oppressors. The Countess negotiated treaties that positioned Wallenberg as neutral ground for diplomatic discussions, turning their small size into an advantage. And Tempest. old, scarred, impossibly persistent Tempest, lived another 7 years after the restoration, long enough to see his stable rebuilt and filled with descendants, long enough to witness the kingdom he'd helped save flourish again. When he finally died peacefully in his sleep, Julian buried him in Schwarzfels Castle's grounds with a monument that read, "He knew the way when we were lost." 20 years after Julian first opened that letter, he stood on Schwarzfeld's castle's rebuilt ramparts, watching ships crowd the harbor and children play in streets that had been empty ruins when he'd arrived. Rebecca stood beside him, their youngest daughter on her hip, their eldest arguing with tutors about mathematics in the courtyard below. "Do you ever regret it?" Rebecca asked. "Choosing this instead of taking the jewels and returning to England?" Julian thought about the Duke he'd been, hollow, purposeless, playing roles without meaning. He thought about the treasure he'd sold to build schools and harbors. He thought about the crown that had been a burden, becoming something he wore with earned pride. "Not once," he said. "I found something worth more than any treasure in that railway carriage." "Your bloodline?" "My purpose," he smiled. "I was a terrible duke because I never understood what nobility meant. Now I do. It means serving something larger than yourself, protecting those who depend on you, building futures instead of maintaining facades." Very philosophical for a man who started this adventure sleeping in stables. "The stables taught me humility," Julian said. "The crown taught me everything else." Below, Karl was training new guards. Elena was arguing with merchants about tariff structures that didn't exist. The Countess was hosting ambassadors in the Great Hall. Former refugees were teaching classes, building homes, raising children who would grow up free in ways their parents never imagined. It wasn't the glorious restoration his grandfather's generation might have dreamed of. It was better, messier, more complicated, more human. A kingdom built by choice rather than blood, maintained by service rather than authority, thriving because people believed in it enough to make it real. "The letter," Rebecca said suddenly, "the one from your grandfather. Do you still have it?" Julian nodded. He kept it in a locked box with the original documents, the map, the photograph of Prince Alexander. Someday his children would read it, would understand the choice he'd made and why. "What do you think he'd say?" Rebecca asked, "if he could see what you built?" Julian thought about those final words. "Blood makes you royal, but choices make you worthy." "I think he'd say, 'I finally figured out what matters,'" Julian said softly. "Not the crown or the title or the bloodline, but the choosing, the commitment, the willingness to stake everything on the belief that broken things can be repaired if you're brave enough to try." Rebecca kissed his cheek, shifted their daughter to her other hip, and started back toward the stairs. "Come on, Your Majesty. Council meeting in an hour, and Elena threatened to start without you if you're late again." "Wouldn't want to disappoint the Prime Minister," Julian said, following her down from the ramparts, leaving the view of his improbable kingdom behind. Below, in the courtyard, their children played a game involving much running and laughter and absolute disregard for royal dignity. Julian joined them, crown forgotten on some table inside, royal robes traded for comfortable clothes that could survive being climbed on by enthusiastic offspring. This was nobility, he'd learned, not standing apart and above, but engaging with life in all its chaotic beauty. Not maintaining distance, but building connection. Not ruling over people, but serving with them. He was King Julian of Wallenberg, descended from princes and raised as a duke, and he'd found his throne not in bloodlines or treasure, but in the simple, profound choice to care more about others' futures than his own comfort. It was enough. More than enough. It was everything.